Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this session of Open Air Virtual Artist Talks hosted by me, Dexter Wimberly, presented by the Harvey B. Gantt Center. I can't believe it's already 2023, and we're going to get started right away today and welcome a fantastic artist to the conversation. I'll start by reading Holly's bio, but also we can have Holly join us on screen. Holly Bass is a multidisciplinary performance and visual artist, writer, and director. Her work depicting Alvin Ailey for the Men of Change, Power, Triumph, Truth exhibition is currently on view at the Harvey B. Gantt Center and the Levine Museum of the New South. Holly's work has been presented at spaces such as the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian Museums, the Seattle Art Museum, Art Basel Miami Beach, Project Miami Fair, and the South Valley Theater. Her work includes photography, installation, video, and performance, and can be found in the collections of the Corcoran Gallery of Art and the DC Art Bank, as well as several private collections. Holly has received numerous grants from the DC Arts Commission and was a 2019 Red Bull Detroit Artist in Residence and a 2019 Dance USA Artist. A gifted and dedicated teaching artist, Holly directed a year-round creative writing and performance program for educated youth in DC's Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services for 4 years, as well as facilitating workshops nationally and internationally. She is currently the National Director for Turnaround Arts at the Kennedy Center, a program which uses the arts strategically to transform schools facing severe inequities. Thank you for joining us today, Holly. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thanks, Dexter. It's really great to be here.
Well, something that occurred to me as I was reading your bio is that it doesn't talk a lot about your origins, your beginnings, and I'm very curious to hear a little bit about that. So first of all, where are you today? Where are you coming from today?
Today, I am coming from the unceded territory of the Anacostan, Piscataway, and Pamunkey people, also known as Washington, D.C., FKA Chocolate City.
And let's talk a little bit about your journey to the type of work that you do. Your work appears to be very socially engaged. One could say rooted in things that are not necessarily part of the quote unquote traditional art world, but things that are much more community oriented. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. I think that, so first of all, I grew up in the Bay Area, in the California Bay Area, and my initial training was really as a dancer and a poet. And then I also became involved in, when I went to school in New York, and graduated, I got involved in the hip hop theater scene. But I've always had a sort of social justice orientation just as a person, which usually showed up as, doing volunteer work in the community, working with local organizations. So that's been a part of my life early on. That's something my parents instilled in me. Is something also, being part of the hip hop theater community. We were always looking at how do we bring in audiences that are not usually invited into theaters and into art spaces. How do we tell our stories, the stories that aren't necessarily being represented in exhibitions and on stage?
Thank you for sharing that. Because you work in so many different disciplines, I'm curious to hear about how you learned these various disciplines. And I'm sure there are a lot of artists out there or aspiring artists who aren't necessarily, approaching the art world from the standpoint of being painters or sculptors, but really have something to say, and they're looking to explore different media that they can use to express themselves. How did you come to work in so many different media?
Yeah, I think it's a really organic evolution. And, I'm an 80s baby. I grew up watching the television show Fame, I'm Davy Allen. And so I would, dance around my house. And finally, my parents were like, maybe we should give her dance lessons. She's just like, kicking and leaping everywhere and had all this energy. And so being able to start formal training was really important. But I also think it's important to note that I grew up in the Black church. And that gave
Mm.
me an opportunity to do liturgical dance in church, to do oratory competitions, to do plays. So there was always to be in the children's choir, right? So if you think about a lot of Black church traditions, it is multidisciplinary. So we were doing, speech and poetry and dance and music and writing. And that was very much so lifted up by my community. And even when I think about durational performance, and this is something that I didn't realize right away, but I was listening to Arthur Jaffa, the video artist, talk about his work, and he created this hours long video piece of Black preachers, and he was talking about that experience of particularly growing up in like a Southern Baptist type of church, or a church that's rooted in that, where you're in church from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And then you go home, you eat, and then you come back to church for evening service. And so I also really have to acknowledge, I think some of the roots of my durational performance is coming out of that cultural tradition as well.
It's interesting you should say that. I grew up in a household that I would say it's like Baptist, you know. My mother, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, but my mother was born in Georgia. And so a lot of the traditions, Southern traditions that she grew up with, sort of along with her brothers and sisters who moved to New York, kind of made its way to New York. And so one of those things was, especially with my aunts, was, this durational, time in the church, and I had many experiences in my preteen days where on a Sunday from 9 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening was kind of engaged in everything that you just described. What's also interesting to me is what you said about how the church is sort of the Black church in particular is very multidisciplinary, and I think that that is something that I don't think I've heard anyone else say, but it's so true, and it's also connected to, in my opinion, probably connected to the broader idea that in the Black community, pardon me, pardon me, one second. I think it's connected to a broader theme within the Black community where a lot of ways of surviving require multidisciplinary thinking. So, you don't just do one thing. You don't just have one job sometimes, and that old trope. What was it? That like Caribbean people, and it's funny. I have so many Caribbean friends who say this to me. It's like you don't just have one job, right? So anyway, that's kind of like going off on a tangent, but sort of inspired by what you said. So talk about your entry point into academia, because you're a teaching artist, right? So we
Mhm.
hear that term a lot, but what does that actually mean?
I mean, it can mean a number of things, but I make a distinction, let's say, between being a teaching artist and being a professor. And so the idea with being a teaching artist is that your artistic practice is alive and well, and that you're using the methods of your practice to teach whatever lesson. So, in terms of my teaching artist work, I've taught in juvenile detention center. I've taught in public schools from elementary to high school. I've also taught in university settings, and I've taught in community settings as well for children and for adults. So to me, that teaching artistry, it's really about taking that living art form, whether that's poetry or performance or dance, and then applying it to multiple educational settings.
I know many artists who teach and oftentimes describe it as just sort of like a mode of survival more so than something they desire to do. Like people who are adjuncts at schools, and sort of like if they had it their way, they wouldn't teach, but they teach because you need an additional source of income. To hear you describe teaching, it seems like it's actually something very much rooted in who you are as a person and as an artist, and certainly a lot is gained from it. And can you talk a little bit about, and again, I don't want to be presumptuous. I will sort of assume that you gain a lot from teaching, but if that is a fact, can you talk about what you gain from teaching?
Yeah, I do think of teaching as part of my practice, particularly when it's in um, less traditional academic settings. So I don't necessarily, I do occasionally teach in university and sometimes as an adjunct or visiting professor. And I will say that that does feel kind of different from when I'm teaching in more community rooted um, settings. But it's in the same way that my work, I want to engage people in conversation and find out about the cultures and subcultures, even within the city I live in. Teaching gives me an entree into that because it's a way of building trust over time and having a really robust exchange with individuals, particularly with young people. You know, I never presume that I am the young people or I know what the young people are thinking and feeling. It's always surprising to, be in settings with teenagers and ask them what's important to them, ask them what they'd like to see different in the world, and to help them move past a kind of, ingrained pessimism to start thinking about the ways that they can actually put that vision into practice and start to make it a reality or move towards it.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. It reminds me of an encounter that I often come back to, an encounter I had some years ago. I don't usually talk too much about like people's age because it's relevant but also not relevant in some ways. But when you haven't spent a lot of time around teenagers and then you do, you realize how different teenagers are than the rest of the world, and also how different teenagers are today versus like how you thought you were when you were a teenager. There's all of those things, and some of it, of course, like has to do with getting older and having a different perspective. But some of it is also very, very true and real. Like they're in a different world than I know I was in, and the things that were important to me. Some of those things are also very important to teenagers today, but they're dealing with a different deck. They're like handling a different deck of cards, right? In some ways. And I remember overhearing a conversation between some young people. Maybe they weren't even teenagers, maybe they were already 20. But it seemed to me like a conversation that I could have potentially added something to, but I decided to just let it play itself out. I'm not gonna try to tell them what I know. I just want them to sort of like work it through themselves, because I think some of those weird conversations that you hear, that that you've had multiple times growing up, and you're hearing people have the same conversation, and you could jump in and just tell them, well, actually, I've decided, I'm just gonna let them, go through the process of figuring that out. It's nothing dangerous, just a weird theories that 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds, they definitely they feel like they've gotten. You said pessimism, but maybe there's also like there's two sides to that. There's like the real pessimistic side, but then there's also this group that just feels like they have it all figured out, know everything, right? And there's that weird that weird balance. And so when you're engaging with young people as a teaching artist, I asked you, what some of the benefits were, but what are some of the challenges?
Ooh, well, I think the biggest challenge personally is to um, really be able to be present and authentic, particularly when I'm working with young Black teens in the city and who are coming from less resourced areas, economically divested areas, who've seen more of the world and its traumas than they should at their age. It's really
Right.
important to be fully
Right.
present and fully authentic. And there are times when it's like I'm I'm like I'm not Caribbean, but to that, old saying, I work many, many jobs. And there would be times when, I'd get ready to go to a school or the detention center and I was tired. But it's like either get it together or go in and be honest and say, hey, I'm really tired today. This is what happened to me, but I'm glad to be here with you. And so just that sort of um, level of transparency and vulnerability that you have to consistently bring every single time because they see right through me, you know. I think that's challenging because like in the adult world, you can just smile and say, "Oh, I'm fine today," and go about your merry way. And I find that doesn't work with the young people. So that's definitely something that's hard. Also, um, I think honestly, particularly in the juvenile detention center, there's just so much trauma and heartbreak, and carrying that and holding space for it is also incredibly hard. Um, there was a point where I had to take a break because I couldn't sort of process all of these stories that I was hearing, particularly when there wasn't that much I could do. I was there to like teach art and poetry, not to save people, not to intervene in their family dynamics. Like that's not my role, nor am I resourced to do that. And so that I think was also really challenging. But I generally find young people um, to be very, they're just great. They're just smart and interesting. And, you know, once you get their attention, once you earn their respect and get their attention, it's great. It's the adults that are actually usually hard to deal with.
I hear you. I hear you. I have a 19-year-old son in Howard University, so you guys are neighbors. We have a slideshow of some of your work that I'd love to get started, so that our viewers can see firsthand some of the work that you do. And so there's a work on screen now. So if you can sort of talk us through what we're seeing here, that would be great.
Sure. This is a video still from the work A Revelation, which is my video homage to Alvin Ailey, and it's currently on view at the Gantt Center. I would say this video in particular, it was very difficult for me to pull still images from it because it's about movement. And so, and it's about his voice, which you clearly can't hear in this video still. But in this still, you're seeing Ailey himself in the center, surrounded by dancers from one of the first televised versions of his most famous work, Revelations. And it's superimposed with images that I made of a kind of A-frame house, which is a recurring motif in my work, which to me speaks to sort of the South and Southern culture. And it's something that he, in the video, if you happen to be able to go to the Gantt Center or see it online, he talks about those origins and how they influence his choreography and his artistry.
Fantastic. And talk about the process you went through to make this work.
So originally, I'm primarily a performance artist, multidisciplinary performance artist, and I also make installations. I wanted to make an installation. I wanted to physically, build the house, have the fabric draping that to me evokes some of his pieces like Revelations or Cry, the piece he made in honor of Black women, and all of the big white skirts and the flowing blue cloths, and then have a video projection of Ailey in the space. And, Marquette Foley from the Smithsonian very kindly told me, no, we don't have space for that. It's got to be 2D. It's got to be flat. And I was like, I don't do flat. So the compromise was to sort of build the installation, which I think we'll see in one of the other slides. And then in post production, kind of blend the imagery from the live installation with the archival footage and then add his voice and music.
Great,
Can we go to the
great.
next?
Let's advance. Yeah, let's advance to the next.
Okay, so here you can kind of see the image superimposed. I don't know how well it translates on screen, but there's a sort of ghostly, shadowy image of Alvin Ailey, and then this outline of a shotgun house with the fabric flowing, the white umbrella, which is very symbolic of the piece Revelations, especially the baptism scene. And I think if we go to the next slide, we'll just see the installation itself.
Wonderful. Let's do that.
Okay. And so here you see this installation of a house that's set outside. There's a chair, an empty chair, which to me that represents, a place for his spirit, his energy to be. He's the center. And then the white umbrella, which, if you've ever seen Revelations, when they do this sort of baptism scene, they come out with these huge white umbrellas and white skirts, and they're dancing and flowing. And then they bring out this blue fabric that's like the river. And so I wanted to put some of those elements that reference back to his most iconic pieces in this installation, which I shot in the woods to try to capture that sense of being in the South, in the lushness and the greenery.
Wonderful. What kind of equipment do you use when you're creating your work?
So I use my cell phone, which is a Samsung Galaxy, to record my videos. Unless I'm doing a project, I also collaborate a lot with a videographer, video artist named Robin Bell. And so
Hmm.
when I'm working with him, then we get the, HD camera. I think he usually uses a Canon. Um, and, we'll do it, shoot it in 4K. But when I'm doing sort of shorter videos myself, cell phone cameras are so excellent these days that you can actually do a lot with them. So yeah, I had an assistant who is on the side off camera with a leaf blower so that we could create wind on demand. And so there's a lot more going on than what you see, but we had to actually construct the house on site and very early in the morning before any of the local businesses started, because just across the street it's actually a bunch of warehouses. But this little alcove gave me a sense of being in a meadow or the greenery.
I love that. I love that. I definitely agree with you about cell phones and cameras and how that technology is so it's so advanced now, and it makes doing video related projects so much more accessible than they were in the past. And I just think that anyone who thinks that they need to buy tens of thousands of dollars worth of video equipment to make compelling videos is completely missing the point. The technology is sort of at your fingertips. Can you talk a little bit more about this A-frame house and why that has sort of made its way into your work?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from, even though I was born and raised in California, my mother's from Alabama, my father's from Georgia. And so they kind of grew up in these shotgun houses. And when I go, I've spent most of my summers down south from childhood on. And so I was always fascinated by these houses, with the front door and the back door, and you could see straight through. And so I just wanted to bring a bit of that history and family history into the work. So it's really just about going back to um, Southern roots, I would say.
That's great. That's great. We have that in common. Let's advance to the next image. So quite
So
different body of
the
work.
yes, very different body of work. Um, this is from, I think, The remaining slides are all from this year or last year. But during the pandemic and coming out of it, um, being able to make video works. This one actually was shot by Robin Bell, and I guess at the beginning of the pandemic, I started a weight training journey, more just for my mental health. But then I fell in love with weight training, and it's not something I ever imagined myself doing. I think that's about 175 pounds that I'm lifting right now. I think my deadlift record, personal best, is like 185 with 5 reps. Um, and particularly for the durational dance pieces I do. So when I'm dancing for 7 hours or 12 hours, it's so important that I'm in incredibly good physical shape and strong and coordinated. And so this was a piece that was shown at the Washington Project for the Arts in an exhibition called Being Becoming that was curated by Yassine Tilala Fall. And it was all Black women doing self-portraiture. And even though I
Hmm.
am in a lot of my work, I don't consider it self-portraiture because I'm usually, um, I feel like I'm embodying a persona or a character. But this was as close to sort of autobiographical self-portraiture as I've gotten. This is my actual gym. My trainer's off screen, but she's there, coaching me, making sure that I'm digging into my heels, bending my knees, bracing, using all my muscles correctly. And so I wanted to kind of play with that as well as the kind of, ads you see for Nike and Reebok. And that's there's a lot of slow mo in the video, but it was a lot of fun to shoot this.
Great, great. Let's advance to the next image. So,
This is an
this,
installation view.
right,
Yes,
right.
this
Now, I
is
wanted to talk about what you did in Venice as well. So maybe we could connect that to this image.
yes, absolutely. And I do have one image from Venice. I don't know if it's the next image, but I wanted the viewers to see how the video work looks in its full installation with the gold frame, because I feel like that's very important. You can see this piece online if you go to the National Portrait Gallery's website. It's currently on view for the Outland Triennial, and it's a video that's 16 minutes and 19 seconds. It's called American Woman. The soundtrack features songs and speeches that cover the last century of American recorded music. So I like to say everything from Mamie Smith to Megan Thee Stallion is in this piece. And that's me watching it with a young friend. And I really think it's important for Black girls to be able to, see images of Black women in museums and to meet living artists. So it was a real treat for me to bring my friend to see my work. She's seen me perform live. And then I think the next slide might be from Venice. So that's the live performance that was done at American Woman, the Venice edition. That was part of Simone Lee and Rashida Bombray's Loophole of Retreat.
How was that experience? Can you talk about it?
It's so hard to put into words, but I can just say it was extraordinary to perform this work in particular for an audience that was predominantly Black women from all over the world. And those 3 days of the Loophole of Retreat were um, just like a dream, like how you want the world to be. You know, I think it was something like 700 Black women, scholars, writers, performers, filmmakers, all gathered together. It was just glorious. It was glorious.
Wow, it sounds fantastic. It sounds absolutely fantastic. And so this was a 30-minute, so you did a 30-minute version of a longer piece, but you did a 30-minute version of it um, in Venice. And
Yes, so I performed this live. Sorry, um, the live performance of this was 7 hours at the Portrait Gallery in
okay,
September, but, because, Venice was a conference and there were a lot of things going on, it didn't make sense to do it for 7 minutes, so I did 30 minutes, which is still quite long for a movement solo.
right, absolutely, absolutely, fantastic work. So, what's really exciting to me about these open air conversations is that not only do we get to talk to fantastic artists and see their work, we also can sometimes get a behind the scenes look in the space that they not only live in but also work in, and we have that opportunity today with you, Holly, and it's going to be quite a treat. So I believe this is the last slide in the series, and we can close the slideshow. Oh, sorry, my mistake. There is one more.
One more slide. This
There
is the
is one
most
more.
recent one I made. I made this, last month. It's currently on view at the Tefra ICA, and it's part of a show that's about rest called Between a Rock and a Soft Place. And so I was very excited to make this work after all of the durational work and international performances to do something about rest. And so this is actually in my home, but I wanted to reference Manet's Olympia, and in particular,
Right.
Black model whose name we now know was Laure or Lore. My French is terrible. Someone else can correct me on that. And so it's this idea of giving yourself the flowers. In Manet's Olympia, she's presenting flowers to the white female nude model. And in my still life, I'm giving myself flowers and I'm resting. And so this is, I think this video is about 4 or 5 minutes long, but it's mostly me lying down.
And can you remind people where they can see your video work? Would that be your website, or there other places where, I mean, again, for someone who's just online and wanting to see some of this work?
So I do have some of my older work on my website, which is my name, hollybass.com. And then the works that are currently on view, um, some of the video works are also on Vimeo. I have a Vimeo page. And then, like I said, the National Portrait Gallery, you can watch the entirety of American Woman, the video, but without the gold frame around it. This piece is currently on view in Reston, Virginia, but I haven't put it on my site yet. So there's I feel like a flurry of work I made toward the end of the year that I haven't been able to upload yet, but it will eventually be on my Vimeo page or my website.
In due time, in due time. So as I had kind of jumped the gun a little bit a couple minutes ago about the studio walkthrough, now we can actually get to uh, walking through your studio and hearing a little bit more about the space that you work in and some of the work that's there. So we can transition to that now. That would be fantastic.
Okay, so that same sofa that you just saw in the video, that's my sofa. This is my live work space. So it's my books and my gym equipment. And then I'm going to take you over to see a few art pieces. So um, this piece here is called Crossing. It's from a series I did called Root Work. And this is taken in Georgia, where my father grew up. He grew up with a sharecropping family. So I'm going to come in a little bit closer. In
Hmm.
this, you can see that's me in white, and I'm trailing my father, who's in his suit and hat, and we're crossing through the cotton fields. And then the piece that's next to it is actually, so if you look at this sort of section of the cotton field, this piece here, it's called Field. It's about the size of a door, so I'm backing up quite a ways to try to get it almost all in the frame. It's actually a cross section of that cotton field, that has been reversed and flipped to create a kind of abstraction.
Wonderful.
And so it's so interesting because I've shown it to people from many different cultures, and they all have different references, and people see different things. Some people see animals and insects and women and grandmothers. And an Ethiopian friend said it looked like, reminded him of Ethiopian tapestry. So I really like all of the references, and also that it derives from this other work, which is really about my family's history. I'm the first person in my family that didn't work in the cotton fields, which I think
Wow.
it was a surprise to me to think about that. But also, many people are shocked to hear that because I think we imagine that that history is from so long ago. I'm going to see if I can get focus on. These are some audio pieces. They're made from Jolly Negro banks. So I sometimes work with uh, essentially racist memorabilia and kind of reclaim it. And so, the way this works, if you take the penny and you put it there, and there's a lever on the back, so the bank will eat the penny. It triggers an audio piece, and so I have a few of these that I've created over the years. And then
Do
I'll
you,
show one more.
where do you,
Mhm.
where do you find those materials?
I was actually getting them through online auctions, and now it's really hard to find the original cast iron ones because there's all these replicas that are made in China out of aluminum, which is both frightening and disheartening. But yeah, these were made in I'm going to say, maybe early 2010s, something like that, or maybe around 2008, 2010.
Hmm.
And lastly, I'll show this. This set is from a play that I've created called the Transatlantic Time Traveling Company, and it features three Black women who are running a traveling medicine show. So, Negro No More is one of the products that they offer to the audience, and it cures all of your Negro problems. So, just a little cheeky play with those are Aunt Jemima bottles. So they're the glass vintage Aunt Jemima bottles um, with a different label. So I'll come back to my desk now. Flip the camera.
Great. Thank you for welcoming us into your space. It's
Thank you.
always it's always interesting to see the things that are not necessarily related to an artist's art making, to kind of give you some insight into other aspects of their life. Can you talk a little bit about your research process and also perhaps talk about artists who have been very influential to the work that you
Mhm.
make?
Sure. I think my research process is definitely influenced by my background and training in journalism. I have a master's in journalism from Columbia, and I worked for the Washington Post and the Washington City Paper for a number of years, and occasionally freelanced for the New York Times. And so, in that journalistic process, I've gotten really comfortable with. Um, I'm worried my earrings are a little too shiny. Tuck them underneath
Don't
there.
worry.
Okay. Um, just being able to enter a community and, you know, old school journalism, we would talk about walking the beat, which is just walking through the neighborhood, getting to know the business owners, getting to know the regulars, sort of walking around and seeing what there is to see, and then starting conversations with people. So a lot of my work uses that as a process. I did a piece called Race Talcon Ash, a performance piece about gentrification in DC. I live in DC. I experienced gentrification, particularly, over the past 10 years. But it was also really interesting to me to set up workshops in libraries and other community settings where I could have conversations with DC residents that I wouldn't normally meet, or a farmer's market. So there's definitely an element of community-based social practice that is part of my research. I also love history and love to go into the archives. And now so many archives are digitized, so you can, from the comfort of your home studio and your laptop, you can go into the Smithsonian archives, and you can see, listen to, you know, uh, early American recordings, listen to audio of, uh, you know, the first generation of Blacks who were emancipated, or the children of that generation. And so I do a lot of that with something like American Woman. I'm searching for, it's important to me to have content from every single decade, from the 1920s to
Mm.
2020. And so I'm constantly looking for who can represent the 1950s and 1940s. How many speeches do I already have? How many songs do I already have? So there's this weeks and months long archival research process that happens well before the 7 hour dance performance that you see on stage, or even the 30-minute performance. I spent so much time and energy um, designing that soundscape so that it becomes the narrative thread of the work, and it becomes even part of the rehearsal process. So by the time I'm doing the dance, I'm improvising, but I know so intimately all of the nuances of each speech and each song, that's what sort of carries the work and drives it along.
And in terms of artists, or even people who are not artists, who have influenced you over the years, who are some of the people that come to mind, have been very
Yeah.
influential on you?
Um, a huge influence on me, I would say, is the poet Gwendolyn Brooks. Both her
Mm.
writing, but also I think the way she approached life and being an educator and being a community member. She was just a very generous person. If anyone sent their poems to her, she would write back with comments. She got a lot of poems for people who were incarcerated, actually. And I remember sending her some of my poems, and I didn't get a response for a long time. And I thought, oh, geez, she's not going to write to me. And then when I finally got the envelope, it was clear that it had been sent back to her. And then she had to rewrap it and send it to me again. And so just that level of care and being rooted in the community. I also think of a writer like Toni Cade Bambara, who also served that purpose of being a cultural organizer and an artist. So those are some of the women that I admire. In terms of performance art, I love Lorraine O'Grady. And
Mm.
I learned about her work probably just in the past 10 or 15 years, which is, one of those things I didn't learn about her in undergrad. Um, so, yeah, those are definitely three women artists that have been a big influence on my work.
I have a few more questions before we conclude today. So you said you did a flurry of work toward the end of 2022. And and so is so sort of like a typical that you develop a lot of ideas and then you get to a point where you want to create all of this work, or was that a byproduct just simply of other things that you had going on professionally?
I suppose it was a byproduct of, you know, I, as an independent artist, I am self-represented. So a lot of the opportunities I get are the ones that I generate myself. So I'm applying
Mm.
for funding, I'm putting in proposals, I'm applying to um, exhibitions, or being sent an invitation. And so toward the beginning of the year, I just thought, okay, I'm gonna apply to all of these things, and I'll get accepted to 50 or 60% of those things. And this particular year, I think everything I applied for, I was accepted into. And so it was just sort of like, oh, I didn't plan for that. And then with the pandemic, also things that were, originally my portrait gallery performance was supposed to be in May, and it got moved to September, and that felt great at
Right.
the time. But then I didn't know that I was going to be invited to come to Venice in October, and so it created almost this like snowball effect where I had to get the work out because I committed to doing the work. And so this year I'm trying to be much more intentional and thoughtful and selective, and just focusing on two or three projects, and with the idea that some invitations may arise. But yeah, it was really just like, what do you call that? An embarrassment of riches. Like when it rains, it pours. So
Uh,
I had to
it,
get it done.
no, that's definitely true. When it rains, it pours. I love the fact that you were talking about this process you had of applying for opportunities, creating your own opportunity. And I'd like to take a moment and talk a little bit about that. I have relationships with many artists, professional relationships, and many artists are among my friends. And I often talk about this idea of not waiting for things to happen, that you have to like make things happen. And it's interesting talking to you as you sort of describe yourself as a self-represented independent artist. Um, but you have so much on your plate, so much to do as a self-represented independent artist. And can you talk a little bit about your relationship to, sort of the more, yeah, like traditional art world? Is that a space that even concerns you, working with galleries, or have you found a path that you're on that's your own?
Well, I think it's different if you do ephemeral work, because I'm a multidisciplinary performance artist. There just aren't galleries that are banging down my door. I do make 2D work, as I showed in the studio visit. I make a lot of video work. But, if I think about someone like Lorraine O'Grady didn't have gallery representation right away, or even Marina Abramovich didn't have gallery representation right away. So part of it, I think, is just my artistic discipline, that it's going to be different because galleries want to sell things. That's really what they exist for. And until I have more things to sell, I'm not going to be as appealing for a gallery to want to represent me. That said, I do show my work in many galleries, as well as museums. And so that's really exciting. It's something that I definitely enjoy. It was incredible for me over the Thanksgiving holidays. My parents came to visit. So I took them to the portrait gallery because it's, right here in my backyard. And for them to see my work in a museum for the first time was just such a thrill. I mean, I have a little video of my mother, and she literally like gasped and like was like, "Oh my gosh," and just the pride that they felt seeing their, I'm a grown woman, but their little girl in a museum with all of these, well-known people, and the Obama portraits are there, and then here's their daughter's work in the same space. So that's really incredible. So I've definitely learned to sort of embrace the art world, but also to accept some of the limitations. And also, frankly, yes, we're in a moment right now where people are buying Black art and looking for Black art, but it very much feels like a moment. Like, sometimes Black art is in vogue and then sometimes it's not. But you have to always be making the work. I remember hearing Carrie Mae Weems give a talk about someone asked what she did sort of during the leaner times, when she wasn't being asked to do as many shows. And she said, I just kept making work because I knew that these spaces weren't designed for me or built for me. I just had to make my work. And so I really take that to heart. Um, you know, I feel like I learn a lot from the generation of Black artists that have come before me. And I want to sort of continue that lineage, but just understanding that my responsibility to my artwork and to myself is just to keep doing the work no matter what.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I'm coming back to something you said about your being the first person in your family to not work, in the cotton fields or work with cotton as labor. And, it reminds me of something that I often have to, sort of talk to, particularly people in my life who aren't African Americans, like my wife, for example, who's Japanese, to remind them of the timeline of recent American history in a way that you, they aren't necessarily thinking about it. For example, I'm 49, but the Voting Rights Act was only 8 years before I was born, right? So you start thinking about these things in that way. My mother, if she were alive, would be 72, but when she was born, her parents couldn't vote, right? So it's like thinking about these things um, in a vacuum has a way of pushing them off into some sort of esoteric um, place where it's not real. When you start thinking about it in those terms, it becomes very, very real. The challenges and the residual hangover of discrimination and the ongoing discrimination and racism that's institutionalized, in America. And I think thinking about things in terms of like real timelines is helpful for people to remember where we are, like where we actually are, not where we think we are, but where we actually are in these timelines.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
my father was picking cotton by hand in 1960. And
right,
so, he shared part of what inspired that work was he shared a story with me. And he remembered being 15 and one day picking the most he had ever picked, which was 214 pounds of cotton. And he earned $7.50 because cotton was going for $3.50 a pound. So, what's incredible to me, there's so many incredible things to me in that story. But one of the things that's incredible to me is that he remembered those figures so vividly. It was a really significant day in his life of the many things that he's accomplished. He was a career military man in the Air Force. He retired as a chief master sergeant, but he remembers being 15 and earning $7.50 in a day picking cotton because that was more than you would have gotten from a factory job would have paid maybe $6 or 6.50,
right,
right? And
right,
then I think about progress in America. So 1960, 1860, he would have gotten $0 because
right.
our ancestors would have been enslaved. So in that 100 years of progress, in a very material way, that 100 years of progress is represented by $7.50 from
No,
1860 to
absolutely,
1960. You
absolutely.
know, so when people are like, "Oh, we made so much progress," we've made progress, but let's not get too excited. Like, there's still some room, to grow. And so thinking about that, 1960, yeah, that was 60 years ago now, but it's still like people are still alive that were alive then. So it's really just a generation ago. And I think it's important for us to, um, as you said, make that context real.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We're coming down to our final few minutes, and speaking of time, so obviously it's in January. It's January, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and celebrating that, among many other things that are coming up. It comes to mind, and as I've gotten older, my understanding and relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. as a person has evolved. One of the more striking things that I think, anyone who is a sort of quote unquote student of history will have these moments when they realize that they're significantly older than the person that they've been admiring for their entire life. And that person may be dead. For example, obviously King was assassinated. And I'm significantly older now than he was when he was killed. And you
Yeah.
start thinking about all of the things that he accomplished
Hmm.
in his life, and how much work there is to do in our own lives, how much work there's yet to be done. I reference that because I appreciate the work that you're doing as an artist, not just artists writ large, but the specific work that you are doing as an artist, Holly. Because I think that you are touching people in a way that is very relevant and will have a lasting positive effect on people's lives. I think going to the spaces that you're going into and teaching young people, interacting with them, it's it's important beyond words. And and I know that it's heavy work. It's heavy work. Anyone who has empathy, and I've been in situations like this where you go into a situation and you're talking to young people who are either, you all these terms get thrown around, at risk or vulnerable or what have you. But you're talking to young people and you realize they need more help than you can give. And that if you're a person who has a lot of empathy, you carry that around with you for a long time after those experiences. It can weigh on you. It can weigh on you. But I would just encourage you and anyone else, keep doing the work anyway, because it's important work, and it's important because how it makes you feel, right? It. If it didn't make you feel that way, then maybe it wouldn't be as important as it is. So I admire what you're doing, and I encourage you to continue making the fantastic artwork that you're making, continue engaging with the community the way that you are. I love the fact that you're carving out your own path, as you say, as an independent, self-represented artist, and you're finding joy in that process. I can see that. And how great is it to have your, as they say, your dance card filled, and you filled it yourself.
Yeah.
Any final words before we conclude today's conversation?
I just want to thank you for your thoughtfulness and the questions that you asked and the insights that you brought. It's been really a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Well, I appreciate you as well. As I mentioned, my oldest son is in his finishing up his second year at Howard University, and I'll definitely be in DC sometime in the near future. So I'll drop you a line, and maybe there'll be an opportunity to grab coffee or something, or do a studio visit. I really appreciate your work,
Yeah,
Holly.
absolutely. Absolutely. We have to do that.
Well, we're about to come to an end to today's conversation, so I'll just have my closing words before we conclude. The Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt to expand its reach and further develop programs like Open Air. To learn more about the ways you can support the Gantt Center, please visit their website at ganttcenter.org/donate. Also, be sure to click the subscribe button on the screen to be updated on all future virtual programs. As always, we thank you for joining us for Open Air and wishing everyone a safe and good night. Thank you.